This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
This month, 15 Democratic senators signed on to what has been dubbed Medicare for All. The bill was introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders, and it's an attempt to promote nationalized health care by linking it to a relatively popular governmental program. Medicare for All sounds nice, but it could just as easily be called VA for All. But with all the problems at government-run VA hospitals, it doesn't exactly have the same feel. Let's state the obvious. The U.S. Senate is not going to pass a bill that creates a single-payer plan for universal health care. The House of Representatives is even less likely to pass such a bill. The plan is an attempt to provide an election-year alternative to the Republican slogan of repeal and replace Obamacare. The phrase Medicare for All has a nice ring to it until you begin to count the costs. 2 blue states have tried similar versions of Medicare for All. Vermont implemented Green Mountain Care in 2011. The state eventually had to abandon this single-payer plan because it would cost billions more than the state could allocate. California also considered a single-payer plan. Even though Democrats have significant majorities in both the Senate and the Assembly, they had to kill the proposal because the cost would be more than double the state budget. Selling the Medicare for All plan to the American voters will be next to impossible. The cost estimates are enough to sink the plan, but also consider that people who are currently on Medicare would be forced to pay more in taxes and get no benefit other than what they already receive. Right now, Americans complain they can't keep their doctor or insurance plan. Under this proposal, they would have even less freedom than they currently have to choose their doctor or hospital. Medicare for All is really a bad idea. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have John Stonestreet with us today, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Let me encourage you, if you have not already done so, to sign up to receive his Breakpoint commentary. It comes to your inbox every day. Of course, you can hear it on these radio stations, but also would encourage you to have access to that. Also, we have a link to the website so you can find out a little bit more. In fact, we've posted one of his articles on love and truth in conflict, just one of many that are available. And, of course, the book that we're talking about, A Practical Guide to Culture. Now, on our website, pointofview.net, one of the articles I've posted comes from the individuals at the Wall Street Journal who said, basically, healthy democracies have ample room for politics, but leave a larger space for civil society and culture that unites more than divides. With the politicization of National Football League and the national anthem, the divided states of America are exhibiting a very unhealthy level of polarization and mistrust. This, John Street, is the world that we live in now. There was a rule that was established a while back. It's in pages A62 and 63 of the league rule book that says that you players are to be on the field and to actually stand and hold their helmets in their left hand. And a lot of that goes back to 2009 when President Barack Obama's Department of Defense began to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars towards the teams by requiring the players and personnel to be on the sidelines and to actually pay attention during the national anthem. In the past, they've been allowed to stay in the locker room. And then they also received other benefits if they showed veterans salutes. So some of this was created. There's some that say maybe it's just time to stop having the national anthem being played, but it illustrates this divided culture that you and I write about so often. When I'm writing my commentary, when you're writing your breakpoint commentaries, we're as Christians trying to speak truth and love in the midst of a culture that is very divided.
It is very divided, and the things that tended to, at least at one point, hold us together are kind of quickly disappearing. There's been some terrific analysis. You mentioned the Wall Street Journal's take on civil society, that there's this whole other aspect of the American experience that goes outside of the government. And that's such an important thing to realize, that not everything is under the purview of government. Not everything should be political, whether it's our guy in the White House or the other guy in the White House. That really, when we lose kind of the strong bonds of civil society, it holds us together even on those things we disagree. So when we lose that, it becomes a really tragic thing. I think Os Guinness has written really strongly on, listen, if we don't have civic education again, we're going to be in big trouble. And so when government continues to creep and politics continues to creep into every area of life, it becomes very difficult to stay together, because the person on the other side, again, becomes more than just wrong. He becomes your enemy. And I think that's one of the reasons that I want to look at this story from this past weekend, Kirby, in so many ways. And look, I can go down the line and say, okay, look, this is what freedom of speech is. Here's what the limits are. Here's the rights of employers to have expectations of their employees. Here's the tradition of the national anthem. Here's why, even protesting the president shouldn't be the same thing as protesting the national anthem. It's not the same thing. I mean, we could go down the line on this, but I want to look and say politics is most often a reflection of culture. And this politics that has crept into sports, and of course ESPN for about the last decade. Oh,
yes, I've written lots of commentaries on that one.
Politics.
Yes.
Oh, man, yeah. I mean, has been politicizing this way before the president did this past weekend. And, even before the protests of last year politicized this. I want to say, what is this reflecting about us as a culture? And I think it's not good.
Well, again, I know when we open up the phones in just a few minutes, a lot of want to speak on one side or the other on this, but let me broaden it, because that's what you're saying. We're looking at culture. We've said, you say, we all say, politics is downstream of culture. And another way in which we can see this division has to do with the various businesses. We can look at Apple and Amazon. We can look at some of these companies that have decided that any group labeled as a hate group, which could be even like the Family Research Council or American Family Association, since the Southern Poverty Law Center knows the hearts of all these individuals and with tremendous ability, that those issues. Then you have, of course, whether it's Home Depot or Lowe's or Target or whatever else, I've wanted to say for some time, and I think you would agree, that can't we at least leave the culture wars out of business? Can't we leave the culture wars out of entertainment? But I guess the answer to that is no, I guess we can't.
No, well, I mean, we're disagreeing, Kirby. A lot of these disagreements are not just kind of on the how, on like how to do culture together, or how to do life together. It's on the what. I mean, we've undergone what I think Roger Eyre once called back in 2013 a cosmological shift, right? We now think human beings are something else other than what they are. We now think that morality is something different than what it is. We're not just disagreeing on specifics. We're disagreeing on fundamental issues, and that's where some of the inconsistencies here, particularly on business, is just crazy. I mean, the number of people that just screamed that Google should fire this employee for a memo are demanding that the NFL stand behind this quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who has who wants to live express what he believes. The one saying the government should stay away. And Trump shouldn't speak to football and privately held business. They're very happy to go in and close down Jack Phillips Bakery and Denver. I mean, the inconsistency here is stunning.
Well, it is. And so, again, if you'd like to join us, we'll open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. We see what happened over the weekend as one example, and we have so many others. And just, again, this inconsistency that I think used to be called hypocrisy, but I found many people, because they have as you just pointed out a minute ago, John, a different ethical system, they don't see this as hypocritical because they don't feel like they have to necessarily play the game the same. You have a lot of people here that say, well, everybody believes in freedom of speech. Go with me right now to the University of California, Berkeley, and say that and see how far that gets you. You know, everybody says, well, these players have their free speech rights. Well, yes, they do, but there's also a rule that they're breaking when they sit down. This is a, you know, again, we say, well, they're allowed to break that rule. Oh, well, then how about breaking some of the other rule? And you go all the way down the line to find that very quickly, if they agree with me, then I'm going to give them, to use a biblical phrase, a fair amount of grace. I'll give them a pass. But if they disagree with them, I'm going to hold them to an entirely different standard. We used to call it hypocrisy, but if you have a different ethical system, it doesn't even look hypocritical to them anymore.
No, it doesn't. I mean, this is the, you know, goes back to the point about civic education. There is a freedom of speech. There's not a freedom from consequences for saying that speech, right? I mean, in other words, you have the right to say it. It doesn't mean that there's no consequences, you know, for saying in an unwise situation or unwise place. And you know what? Frankly, that includes our president as well. I mean, you know, he's also had the right to say what he said about the NFL, but he also has to take the shots that he articulated as, you know, at the same time. The other part of this, though, Kirby, and I you know, I know you're the interviewer here, but I'd love to ask you about this.
No, it's fine.
Does it say something about our culture that we're talking about athletes here, right?
Right.
And that this was that big. I mean, you know, the thing about, you know, what Neil Postman wrote years ago, that we've amused ourselves to death, and we've become an entertainment-driven culture. Look, you know, I'm a conservative. I'm a political conservative, but by and large, the president is an entertainer, right? He has had a career as an entertainer. So to say that politics reflects culture, you know, in the White House, we have a kind of an entertainer in chief, and at the same time, we have people that are considered far more important than you know, their actual contributions. That's athletes. And I love sports. I'm a big basketball fan, for example. I even love watching the NFL. But as one of my mentors once said, in other times and other places, heroes made history. And in our time and place, they make, you know, CDs and touchdowns. What does that say about us, that this conversation so dominated national attention? You know, especially when we have issues like Puerto Rico and North Korea. And I'm not saying it's not important at all, but that's one of the things that I think is reflected in our culture, that we're an entertainment-driven society, and that's one of the things complicating this.
I think so. I want to speak to that after the break, but since we're coming to a break, let me just give you a chance to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I love how Wall Street Journal put it. You know, no doubt most Americans agree with Mr. Trump that they don't want their flag disrespected, especially by millionaire athletes. But Mr. Trump never stops at reasonable, and so he called for kneeling players to be fired or suspended, and if the league didn't comply, for fans to boycott the NFL. Right now, I would like the president focused on North Korea, not sounding like maybe a sports radio program jock, but we'll see, and you may have some comments about that as well. And isn't it interesting that entertainment has so dominated our culture, sports has so dominated our culture? We even find ourselves today talking about this when we have so many other issues that we could be talking about, and we will. But I did want to bring this to your table today and to an opportunity for you to comment about it. We're privileged to have with us John Stonestreet, and we'll continue with him right after this.
Can you name the longest-running talk show in television history? Can you? It was Larry King Live, which ran for 25 years. That's a good run made possible by millions of dollars in advertising money. But did you know that this year, Point of View celebrates 45 years on the air? 45 years made possible by people like you. No program lasts that long without making a difference, and we realize the many stories we know are just the proverbial tip of the iceberg of what God has done and is doing through your giving. You make every bit of that possible. Stop what you're doing for a couple of minutes, make the call, or click on in and be the one listener out of 800 who invests in changing lives. Join the team. Do it monthly. Not investing takes no effort. Be exceptional. Be the one. Call 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Be the one. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with John Stonestreet, co-author of the book A Practical Guide to Culture, also the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And at the moment, we're talking about the NFL protest. And I mentioned just a few minutes ago something that you perhaps have seen before, where it says the NFL rule book specifically requires players to stand. Well, it's not in the players' rule book. You know, if you go to the rule book, that just talks about what's offsides and blocking and those kinds of things. There seems to be maybe some evidence that it's in the operations manual. So, again, be careful when you express that in Facebook or Twitter. But it really brings us back to the bigger issue, because some people have said, have we always had players standing on the sidelines during the national anthem? And the answer is not necessarily. As I mentioned, you can go to this very good article by Timothy Meads and others that have been documenting this for some time, that in 2009, the Department of Defense, under President Barack Obama, really wanted to show support for the troops and all the rest, so they began to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to teams in sort of a marketing strategy. I do love what Senator Jeff Flake one time said, though, and that is, you know, you go to sporting events and you see them honoring the heroes, you get a good feeling in your heart. Then you find out that they're doing it because they're being compensated for it. It kind of leaves you underwhelmed and doesn't seem quite right. So that's the issue on the table. But more importantly, we want to think about how to address these kinds of issues in a divided culture, whether it's what happens on the NFL, what's happening with Apple and Target, and all these other issues that we've addressed on Point of View, how to think about how we should have a consistent Christian response in a divided culture. So, John, some good points, and I think your point you made just before we went to the break is a good one. It shows how entertainment has become preeminent, and how this, in some respects, has superseded and pushed off of the front pages some very real concerns about how do we deal with people that were flooded in Houston and in the Gulf Coast? How do we deal with people who were devastated in Florida or Puerto Rico? How do we deal with Kim Jong-un in North Korea? What do we do with the possibility of a nuclear Iran? Those are the kind of issues I'd want our president to be focused on, and frankly, I'd want our national audience to be focused on, not this particular issue about the NFL.
No, that's exactly right, and that's one of the consequences of being entertainment-driven society. Is that, as I think Ravi Zacharias often quotes this, we see with and not through the eye. So we take everything at face value based on image and how things are told. And so, I mean, you brought up a great point that it was only in 2009 that this requirement to stand at the national anthem was part of it. And but for the record, the start of playing national anthem before sporting events goes back to the middle of World War I, and it was kind of a spontaneous sort of thing. Most nations around the world don't play the national anthem. I also think it's something to think about, too, as we've kind of figured out, well, what is the national anthem? What does it represent? Colin Kaepernick's initial protest was against police. It wasn't against the nation. And so, that there's kind of an incongruity there. I think that it's also worth noticing that there's right now an awful lot of people in America outraged for how the NFL players treated the national anthem, who go to sporting events week after week after week and don't respect the national anthem when it plays. Right? I mean, there's a lot of inconsistency there as well.
Sure.
And that's really what I'm talking about in the book A Practical Guide to Culture, is that all of these things are wonderful opportunities to have conversations with the next generation, to take them deeper into what they actually need to know about. And when we get caught up in kind of the outrage game, then one of the things that we miss is that opportunity to help our kids get underneath what we call in the book one of the undercurrents of culture, and that is that it's kind of an entertainment-driven society where we don't actually think anymore. We're entertained to death. We're amused to death. We're like the dogs on that movie Up. It's like Squirrel. We go from one bleeding headline to another bleeding headline to another one without ever stopping and saying, look, God has given me my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and I'm supposed to love him with all of those things. So what does it mean to think clearly about the culture in which we live, and just even stopping and getting beyond the divide, and stopping and getting underneath the outrage and saying what's really happening here, and asking those questions is a wonderful educational opportunity, not only for ourselves but certainly for the next generation, that we want to be able to make a difference in the culture in the future.
Well, some of the wisdom and discernment from John Stonestreet, and let me again encourage you to follow some of the links. This practical guide will be very helpful to you as a parent or a grandparent. Very well written, 350 pages. It is written by John Stonestreet and Brett Kunkel, and it is published by David C. Cook. It's a practical guide to culture, helping the next generation navigate today's world. He's a fellow traveler because he has daughters as well, going through some of these questions, and I think you'll benefit from that. Just before we take some phone calls, I guess one other comment I'll make is I do wonder about the future of the NFL. I posted on my Facebook page a very insightful article about the number of young children no longer want to be in football, or they'll play maybe when they're young, maybe Pop Warner, but by the time you get to the next level, you go from 5 teams to 1 team, and that is certainly an issue. You've prevailed upon, I think, the graciousness of the various customers for so long by charging them outrageous prices to go to these games, charging the same amount to go to a preseason game as you do to a regular game when the players aren't even playing there. You've prevailed upon them to turn a blind eye to domestic violence and all sorts of other problems, and you've seen some pretty pampered multimillionaires allowed to be on the field only because they have athletic prowess. And I think somewhere along the line, and it's starting to happen right now, there are a lot of people going to make a comment as we talk about this as one cultural item that we can begin to discuss. So we'll head to Maine first, WSEW. Joyce, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. I just want to comment that one of the things I have a problem with is these folks, when they take the knee and all, and they talk about freedom of speech. First of all, they're not talking; they're doing an action. But then if I comment on it, I'm a racist. I don't have the same freedom to be able to voice my opinion, and they, kind of attack you and say, "Oh, you don't know what we're trying to do." But I do want to say that. Do you know Brandon Tatum?
I do not.
Okay, he's on. I don't know if he's a football player or who he is. It's just I saw his article on Facebook today. He is popular, but he wrote the most eloquent thing, more eloquently than I could ever say it, about this whole issue, and about he is a black man, and he was talking about how we need to look at our country is not perfect, but it is it's the greatest country in the world. And he talked about how far that this country has come. He says, I'm not out in the field picking cotton anymore, and I have the same education that offered to me that others have. And he went on all these the things that we should be concentrating on.
Yeah. That'd be very good.
It was a wonderful article.
Yes. And Joyce raised a good question, because John Stonestreet, sometimes we recognize that Jesus said to turn the other cheek, and you almost have to verbally, because if you say, I've just got some questions as to whether or not we should tear down these monuments, they say, oh, well, then you're a white supremacist, I really think that Baker in Colorado should be allowed to decide whether he will or will not bake a cake for same-sex wedding. Oh, well, then you're homophobic. There is this knee-jerk jump that the other side sometimes gives as people make a reasonable, common sense, sometimes even gracious statement. You've got to try not to react in kind when sometimes you're getting labeled in ways that are simply inappropriate.
No, that's true, and then you certainly cannot be winsome enough on some issues, to either change somebody's mind or even be considered as less than the enemy. But again, our tone and our responsibility to treat other people with respect is not based on whether it works, and it's not based on whether they treat us with respect. It's actually based on what we know to be true fundamentally as Christians about every person that we talk to, and that is that they're made in the image of God and that they need truth, just like we need truth. And so that's really important. I did want to comment, too, that freedom of speech in the First Amendment does cover more than just words. It actually covers expression. And so, that's important. But you're not in a situation of employment or something like that, you're not completely free from the consequences of your expression. You have the right to express it as a citizen. That doesn't mean you have the right to keep your job and express it, or you have the right to be a representative of someone and express it. And that's an important, I think, an important conversation. And look, I do think that there needs to be a dual conversation happening right now on the issue of race. Now, first of all, I think that if we believe that this issue that happened over the weekend is an issue about race, then we're believing the media narrative, and that's not true. It didn't start that way. It didn't start. Colin Kaepernick's conversation wasn't one about race. It was about the treatment between police and African-American citizens, which clearly isn't okay on either issue. I mean, we've got blow-ups happening all over society. Now, whether, the one side of that argument is the better read or the other side is a conversation for another day. But this isn't all about race, and we just can't believe the media tail on this and think that it is.
We'll take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. America is known for its commitment to religious liberty. People have always fled foreign lands persecuting their faith for a safe place to exercise their religion. That's part of the story of our founding. For the most part, the majority religion practiced here has been Christianity. According to a recent poll by the Public Religion Research Institute, that may be changing. The survey, conducted in all 50 states with more than 101,000 Americans, is called America's Changing Religious Identity. The big takeaway is that the religious landscape is changing in this country, especially in the under 30 crowd. There are Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist populations that are on the rise, while the Christian community, both Catholic and Protestant, appear to be shifting downward. It's an interesting study and worth our attention. It reminds us that the promise of the First Amendment is a promise that Americans would be free to exercise their religion, not the religion of the state. It also reminds us that religious liberty is a promise for all religions in this country. I think that promise is a good thing. It allows for a robust debate, the opportunity to debate finer theological points, and to settle our disagreements over eternal matters peacefully and respectfully. The bottom line is this: America's religious landscape may change, but our commitment to religious liberty cannot. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Stonestreet with us for a few more minutes. I just might mention Dr. Paul Barreca will be in studio with us in the next hour. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And, one of the other things, John, we might bring to the table is recognizing that sometimes no matter what you do, even if you do the right thing, you're going to be criticized, so you might as well do the right thing. A good example of that happened yesterday, where it was a decision made by the Pittsburgh Steelers to not take the field until after the national anthem. But except one individual decided to, and that was the Steelers' offensive tackle, and a former Army Ranger, by the way, Alejandro Villanueva. And so he actually stood for the national anthem. And you would think nobody would criticize him. As a matter of fact, I've heard some people on other talk shows say, well, he was such an outstanding example. Well, yes, he was criticized by the coach himself, Mike Tomlin, who said, I was looking for 100% participation. We were going to be respectful of our football team, and really complained that one of his players, the offensive tackle, Alejandro Villanueva, actually stood outside of the entrance there during the national anthem. So it seems like whatever you do, whether you do something right or wrong, you're going to be criticized. Might as well do the right thing, don't you think?
You might as well do the right thing. Plus, our reward is in heaven. And that's the sort of world, by the way, Kirby. I'm so glad you brought up that story. It was a great story. It just underscores almost everything we talked about today, right? That we've become so entertainment driven, that a coach would say that, an Army Ranger veteran's highest loyalty is to the football team, not to the country that, he fought in Afghanistan for. I mean, when you kind of see it in those terms, it's just crazy. And then the contradiction of that this is an act of freedom of speech to kneel or to not come out for the national anthem. Well, if it is, why isn't it an act of freedom of speech to come out and actually, stand at attention and recognize that? I mean, it's an inconsistency through and through and through. But that's the sort of world we got to prepare the next generation for, Kirby. That's one of the reasons Brett and I tackled, this book together, is that it's not just that we're preparing kids to deal with a culture that teaches things that aren't true or that undermines in many ways their deepest convictions about life, marriage, religious liberty, God, Jesus, the Bible, but that by doing so, by living out your deeply held convictions, you'll pay a price. And that's a different culture than you and I grew up in, right? I mean, we didn't usually think those thoughts along those lines, that to live in this culture as a Christian and maintain my deeply held convictions might not just be that I'll get made fun of or be disagreed with, but actually it could cost me something. It could cost me a job. It could cost me a pension. And so Christian parents and mentors looking for the next generation, we have to be about cultivating their deepest loyalties and identities around Jesus Christ. And that's really the theme that runs throughout the book, is how do we address these very real cultural issues, realizing that the most true thing about our world is that Christ is risen from the dead, and the most true thing about our kids is that they belong to him. And for them to understand that is a prerequisite for them to engage the culture well.
Again, the book is entitled A Practical Guide to Culture. There's a rowboat on the front, and that's because, of course, we've been looking at a lot of floods and waters right now, because a lot of it talks about the cultural waters, the pounding cultural waves, and really the whole issue of culture, and then Christian Worldview Essentials. 19 chapters, 350 pages, just a wonderful manual. That's why it's called A Practical Guide to Culture, helping the next generation navigate today's world. And if you really want to world-proof your kids, by the way, that's another good book I might recommend. This is certainly a great opportunity for you to learn from the wisdom of John Stonestreet and Brent Kunkel. Let's take at least one or two more phone calls before we run out of time today. We'll head to New Hampshire this time. Joyce, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Oh, hello, Kirby. Number one, I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic, and I agree with everything you say, and John Stonestreet as well. Can you hear me?
We sure can. Go ahead.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, I just want to say my father fought in World War II, and I have two kids. One just got out. My daughter just got out, but my son is in the Army. And we have been brought up, I have been brought up to just respect and love this country. It is the greatest country in the world. And it just absolutely breaks my heart to watch these games and to have these people kneel down to something that is so important in this country. It is just a total lack of regard and disrespect. It's showing our children what are we showing our children? How to respect this country. It's the morals and the ethics have just collapsed. It just breaks my heart.
Sure. I was just thinking in Romans 13, John, it talks about the fact that we are to obey those in authority, ultimately respect those in authority. 1 Timothy 2 talks about praying for those in authority. And today we do seem to have, first of all, a breakdown in the family where kids sometimes don't respect their parents. We have a culture of almost sort of ethical anarchy where people don't respect any kind of authority, whether it's ecclesiastical authority or civil authority. So in some respects, that's another starting point for our children and grandchildren, just to help them understand that we are under authority, ultimately under God's authority, but also God has placed us under other institutions. We're under that authority as well. And when they see such a disrespect in so many different aspects, this is just one example, but it's a very prominent example of showing disrespect, we really are going to have to counter-program to that, aren't we?
Well, no, that's right, and that's one of the features of secular modernism is, that we are our own highest authority, and that there's no one above us. I mean, after all, if we're not created, then we're self-determined, and that just kind of undermines the concept of authority from the very beginning, which is why, cultivating a Christian worldview is something that you and I have kind of made our whole careers about. And I've got to agree with the caller, Kirby, that you do a great job of that every day on Point of View, and I just think Point of View is such an important part of the worldview education of so many. I also want to add, though, the historical tie, and that is that I think one of the reasons we see such disrespect when it comes to our nation is that we don't have a good civic education, and particularly the history of the U.S. Many people don't even know what the Pledge of Allegiance is about. They don't understand what the First Amendment is really about. And so what happens is, and you and I both talked about that, is in many ways, our freedom of speech, religion, association, all those things built into the First Amendment have been replaced by the new kind of sexual freedom, and that becomes the new First Amendment on a practical level in our culture. And that's not something you can build a civilization on.
I certainly agree. Let's, if we can, encourage people to go to the Colson Center for Christian Worldview to make sure they subscribe to Breakpoint. And while you go to either our website or that website, get a copy of A Practical Guide to Culture, helping the next generation navigate today's world. And I suspect in the next couple of days we'll be reading a Breakpoint commentary that will include some of the things we've talked about today. So, John Stonestreet, always great to have you on this program with us.
Well, you too, Kirby. Thanks for everything you do and for all your support of the Colson Center. And love to work beside you here in the kingdom. It's you're a great friend. Thank you so much.
Let's take a break. When we come back, Dr. Paul Barreca with us, and we'll be talking about some great resources, Follow the Master. But you know what we do here at Point of View is kind of like making disciples, which is one of the things we'll be talking about next hour. And we really, really try as hard as we can with a lot of emphasis and a lot of expertise and a lot of interviews and other things to help you begin to understand biblical truth and how to apply that biblical truth to your life. So in honor of our 45th anniversary, we've encouraged you to join with us. And one of the things that I mentioned just a few minutes ago is for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, you can receive the Bible Stick. But for $45 a month, we not only include that, but also this booklet. And if you haven't had a chance to join with us, let me give the pledge line right now, because you could call and find out more about how to join with us, and I would encourage you to do so. That number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. We'll be back right after this.
Can you name the longest-running talk show in television history? Can you? It was Larry King Live, which ran for 25 years. That's a good run made possible by millions of dollars in advertising money. But did you know that this year, Point of View celebrates 45 years on the air? 45 years made possible by people like you. No program lasts that long without making a difference, and we realize the many stories we know are just the proverbial tip of the iceberg of what God has done and is doing through your giving. You make every bit of that possible. Stop what you're doing for a couple of minutes, make the call, or click on in and be the one listener out of 800 who invests in changing lives. Join the team. Do it monthly. Not investing takes no effort. Be exceptional. Be the one. Call 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Be the one. Point of View will continue after this.
I've been listening for about 26 years. I just wanted to say that y'all have helped me a lot because you've given opportunity to call our congressman and make phone calls, write letters and all, and I appreciate the website that we can get on and sign petitions and things like that, and I feel like it makes a big difference. I signed up yesterday to be a supporter, and I think it's well worth it.
I began listening to Point of View when I was 19 years old. I just can't even begin to tell you how much that this ministry has meant to me, especially now being a father. The values and things that I hear on Point of View and how you shaped my worldview and made me passionate.
Political things that are being done to our nation, you just cannot bury your head in the sand and say it doesn't exist and I hope it goes away.
Point of View is actually a lifeline for me. I homeschool my girls, and I don't think I could do what I do without Point of View on a daily basis.
If I hadn't listened to Point of View, I just had no clue how important your show was.
I'd just like to encourage your listeners that even small givers are important. Consistency is the key.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today talking about discipleship. And if you've listened to this program any length of time, we've talked about that. As a matter of fact, on our Millennial Roundtable, one of our guests constantly says that we're probably pretty good at making converts, but not necessarily making disciples. And so we're going to talk about this because of two books that we want you to know about. You can go to our website, pointofview.net, and find out about these books. And in studio with me today is Dr. Paul Barreca. If that name sounds familiar, if you've listened to our program before, you know that we have actually done trips to Israel and Greece with him. He's a good friend of Point of View. He's very passionate about discipleship. And so, Paul, thank you for joining us today.
Kirby, thank you so much. It's great to be here with you today, and so much looking forward to talking to your listeners about discipleship. I'm just so passionate about this, and it's been the focus of my ministry for so many years.
Last time we talked with you, of course, were a pastor and have been a pastor in New Jersey, have been a pastor for 33 years, now the executive director of Fellowship International Mission. And we have a link to that website and to your website so people can find that as well. I'm going to be talking about two books, especially the newest one, but one that I am familiar with and have a chance to read over the years. Follow the Master, a discipleship course for growing Christians. And this is just great for new believers. So I will mention that, but I really want to focus a lot of our time and attention on this new one, Follow the Master, How Jesus Made Disciples. So we'll cover both of those, but talk about this for just a minute because, you know, we are supposed to make disciples, but the reality is that some people don't seem to have your passion that you do for making disciples. Where'd that come from?
Well, we hear a lot about making disciples. Probably all of us have been to a missionary conference or heard a sermon and heard the Great Commission preached to us. But in the pastoral ministry, as a senior pastor, I've been thinking and trying to help our people develop into mature disciples. How do we do that? A lot of us have maybe an unintentional way of doing that. We started looking at the goal of what that ought to be. The goal ought to be producing mature, self-sustaining, reproducing disciples, not just church attenders. And so we thought about ways to do that, and over the years developed some curriculum to help our members at our church do exactly that.
Well, and again, this one on certainly for growing Christians or new believers is one of those. And again, I just think that both of these resources would be very good because whether you're a new believer or not, you know new believers, or if you are doing evangelism at all, you will have new believers. And then, of course, the other one that is, I think, part of some of the research that you've done over the years in terms of really understanding how Jesus made disciples.
That passion for discipleship prompted me to do some graduate work and attend some seminary courses and work on my doctorate. And my dissertation for that was on discipleship. So
yes.
In doing that research, I really started looking back to the example of Jesus. One book that was really influential, Kirby, I'm sure you've read it, and a lot of seminary types of guys and girls have read A.B. Bruce's book on discipleship called The Training of the 12. Well, that's a little bit heavy for most of our listeners. So I wanted to take some of those ideas and make them accessible for us and for really the average person in church to be able to understand some of the ways in which Jesus approached training his disciples.
I don't want to be overly critical of the church, but you've probably been in churches, you've seen other churches. You would think that making disciples is what churches are all about, but we haven't necessarily done the best job of that, have we?
No, probably everybody talks about discipleship. We've heard it in our churches, we've heard sermons, we've gone to mission conferences. But a real question to ask is, what is the plan in your church or in your life to actually do that? And so for our church, I wanted to give us some resources so that it wasn't just the pastor or the evangelist doing that, but it was all of the church members. And so with some curriculum tools and some training and some just some way to guide our members, we were able to see lots of our members actually having follow-up Bible studies and small group studies and one-on-one studies with their friends, and not having to rely on the pastor or the professional Christian, so to speak, to be able to do that.
Yes. Talk about how important discipleship is today, because we think of that in the first century, and we certainly, if we were with a parachurch organization on various college campuses, they talk about discipleship. But how does that fit in today? Can you give us a perspective on that at all?
Well, your ministry here at Point of View is equipping and in helping listeners engage the culture. And you talk a lot about issues that are related to things like transgender and changing values and things of that nature. Well, those folks, if we're reaching people in our churches, they're going to be coming with that set of values, with the secular set of values. And so if we want to see them change, we have to teach them and show them and convince them by the Word of God, on the basis of God's Word, what biblical values look like. And we think that if we do that through discipleship, particularly at the beginning of someone's walk with the Lord, or perhaps someone has come to church and maybe they've been to a church that really hasn't taught the Word or really hasn't taught about some of these issues, if we can get them into some studies and to some curriculum and really focus on that intentionally, we can address some of these cultural issues that just kind of come with the baggage of life that we bring sometimes into our Christian experience.
It does seem to me, too, that we've always needed discipleship, but we probably need it more in the 21st century than you needed since the first century, because in the first century, you were really birthing Christianity in a hostile culture. And there was a point in time where eventually Christianity began to be a majority. For a while, technically, it was a monopoly. But now it is faded. And so I think in some respects, churches maybe didn't have to think about discipleship because everything in the culture was reinforcing sort of biblical values. But it seems to me today, if there's ever a time we need discipleship and to begin to develop a Christian worldview, it's the fact that we're really going to have to live in a counterculture way, aren't we?
Yes, we are. And over the years, I've been developing this curriculum for many, many years. And in the latest development, which is the book you mentioned, Follow the Master, a discipleship course for growing Christians, I actually had to add, or thought it would be necessary to add, a couple of chapters that weren't in there earlier. One was on love, sex, and marriage, because we found most of the young couples coming to our church were living together. And it's perfectly acceptable in our culture. So how do we talk about that and get them on the biblical point of view, or the biblical worldview in those areas? And so we added a chapter on that, and we also added a chapter on the sanctity of life, which is something new believers really need to learn, because the cultural acceptance, the worldview that is from our modern culture today, would say that even abortion is something under certain circumstances that might be acceptable. Well, we want to make sure that everyone in the church, from the very beginning of their experience as being a believer in Christ, has the tools and the teaching from God's Word to guide them in these principles.
Talking about discipleship today, and the book series is called Follow the Master. The first one we've been talking about is a discipleship course for growing Christians. I've got the original autograph there. It had 32 chapters. This one has 34 because you added some of that. And then we'll be also talking about Follow the Master, How Jesus Made Disciples. These are two excellent books, and we have a link on the website so that you can actually obtain those. I would think, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this, how pastors could use this, how small group leaders could use this, how Sunday school leaders could use those. But you could use it yourself as well. Maybe you've just become a Christian, you've been listening to Point of View, and you say, well, I would like to have someone disciple me. I don't know who that is. You can actually work through the book yourself, and it is a self-study, but it would certainly be the best in a church setting. So we're going to talk about that and also get into some of the ideas and, frankly, miscommunicated ideas and misinformed ideas about discipleship, and maybe give you a little bit of an understanding of this concept of upline and downline. So we're going to cover all of that. Dr. Paul Barreca in studio with us today, but we need to take a break, and when we go to the break, good time for you to go to our website, pointofview.net, find out more about the Follow the Master books. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, when the U.S. debt officially reached $20 trillion, some listeners ask who owns this debt. In the past, we were assured that the national debt wasn't a big deal since we owe it to ourselves. I never thought that comment was very reassuring then, and it simply isn't true now. The U.S. borrows heavily from foreign countries, especially the Chinese, and this creates the first problem: foreign influence. One former member of Congress put it this way: whoever pays the piper gets to call the tune. Foreign leaders aren't inclined to whistle Yankee Doodle. Another problem is that these countries are not an infinite source of credit. They have their own economies to deal with and will probably want to put their investments closer to home, especially as they look at the current congressional spending spree. Are we approaching a time when America's excessive borrowing makes us a bad credit risk? Sometimes the U.S. looks like some of the citizens who have maxed out their credit cards and have nowhere else to turn. The amount some of these countries hold in American debt is staggering. The U.S. government owes China $1.1 trillion. Saudi Arabia probably has about $700 billion in assets. A number of years ago, they threatened to sell that much off when Barack Obama was president. These countries that have been lending America money may not wish to invest any more in America and might even decide to withdraw their current investments. In previous commentaries, I've warned about the possibility that these foreign investors may simply decide to cash in their treasury bills and invest them closer to home. If our creditors cut us off, our treasury securities could reach junk bond status. The lesson here is simple. Before you spend the money, you need to know where it's coming from. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, once again, we have in studio with us Dr. Paul Barreca talking about Follow the Master books, and we're going to focus on both of those. And I've already spent a little bit of time talking about a discipleship course for growing Christians, also a new one, How Jesus Made Disciples. All of that information at our website, pointofview.net. And Paul, one of the things that we run into is that people have different perspectives about what discipleship is. Sometimes they have some real misconceptions. Can you kind of clarify some of that for us for a few minutes?
Well, because discipleship is so frequently talked about in churches and in sermons, I think maybe a lot of Christians and a lot of our listeners might think, well, yeah, we do that at our church.
Oh, yeah, we do that. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, we
got that covered.
Yeah, we think about that. But you know what I've discovered? For most churches, the discipleship plan for someone that maybe wants to start coming to the church, or perhaps you've been talking to a neighbor, a friend, or coworker, and they've made a decision, they've trusted in Christ. In most churches, the follow-up plan or the discipleship plan is, well, you just come to church.
Yeah.
And by coming to church, you'll hear sermons and you'll learn how to live the Christian life. I'll be honest with you, Kirby, when I was growing up, that's kind of how I learned about the Christian faith.
Yes.
No one really spent time and did any one-on-one Bible study with me, or some of that happened in Bible school later on, but for my teen years and the early part of my Christian life, I did what everybody else did. I came to church. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of folks do that. Now, that's a wonderful thing. And if you're in a good Bible teaching church, you certainly will learn a lot about the Bible and you'll catch on. But the problem with church, or the limitation, I shouldn't say the problem, the limitation with church is that it's a one-way communication.
Right.
When Jesus discipled his 12, it was a life exchange. It was life upon life. And he was interacting with them and walking with them and teaching. And just in the everyday course of life, there were things that came up that were teachable moments, whether it be the mustard seed or the fig tree or the walk along the way or the Pharisees. And there were all of these life lessons about the sea and the storm and just things that were everyday part of first century life.
Sure.
And so for folks today, as we think about discipleship, I think maybe we might think about coming to church. That's really how you grow. Perhaps some others go a little bit further, and they might do a follow-up course. There's some great ones out there. Navigators, other ministries have some follow-up courses with short little lessons that are, you kind of take it home and do a lesson and then come and review it with someone that's going to be a teacher or mentor. That's certainly better, and that's an improvement. Some folks, for the idea of discipleship, they might think of one-on-one. That's a good way to disciple, but as we look at Jesus and his example, he really didn't do much one-on-one with the 12. In fact, the only time I could find that Jesus was one-on-one was with Peter, restoring him by the Sea of Galilee after he had denied the Savior 3 times. So really, even one-on-one was not Christ's primary focus on training the disciples. It was the life interaction that they shared together. And so these are some of the things that in my understanding and growth and Bible study and talking with others about this have begun to develop in putting these into some materials that folks can use.
You know, I was just thinking about in the book of Acts for a while there, Jesus at one point, I think, is with 120, but then he has his 12, and then he has his 3, so we understand that. But again, the numbers weren't so much the issue. It's, like you said, life on life, doing life together. I can't think is one of the phrases a lot of the millennials talk about these days. And that's where you really have a sense of discipleship. And the few people I've ever had on this program that have ever talked about discipleship, usually it's where they say, well, come and live with me or come and meet me. And it isn't just a one-time going to a breakfast, but it's hanging out with me, right? Is that fair?
That's exactly right. Kirby, one of the things about first century discipleship, the concept as it was known in the first century, involved 2 primary parts or 2 primary understandings. The one was the idea of following, and a disciple was someone who followed. I mean, even back to the Greeks, Aristotle had his followers and disciples. Socrates had his followers.
They would literally follow, yes.
Yes, exactly. They'd travel together, and Jesus' disciples did that. The other idea, and it comes from the root word of what discipleship is, or what that word disciple means, it has to do with learning.
Right.
And it was a different kind of learning. When we think of learning, we think of a classroom, sitting and taking notes and hearing a lecture. But this learning was the learning that took place life on life. If I could use one illustration, when I was a kid growing up, my dad was a baker. And when I was 10, 11, 12 years old, boy, the idea of going to the bakery with Dad was pretty awesome, especially because it was all night long. And, kids love to stay up at night, right? So every now and then a holiday or something, I'd get to go with Dad and go in the bakery. Well, you learn something about baking. You learn some things that really can't be taught in a textbook or in a video. And that's the kind of learning that is part of the first century idea of discipleship. It's what Jesus did with the 12.
Yes. And I think this in some respects illustrates how your books are a little bit different. Again, I recognize that there are a lot of those good follow-up books. I think you did a Google search and found out there are just enormous number of books on discipleship. But when you talk about this kind of, if you will, discipleship course that you've put together, this is a relatively unique set of resources, isn't it?
Well, there is. I found some really good resources, some by MacArthur. There's some great authors. Tom Blackaby has some great books. Bill Hull, Robert Coleman, Aubrey Malphurs. There's some great books about how to do discipleship or the philosophy of discipleship.
Good people.
But when I looked for curriculum, like actually, well, what do I teach and how do I teach? And if I'm a member of a church or if I just want to help a friend or maybe grow myself, how do I do that? I didn't
Be the one out of 800 listeners who support this ministry. And if you value the conversation we're having today about discipleship and wanting to apply some of this in your own life, I hope that you will, as you're appreciating this particular presentation, would also take the time to share with us. It could be a one-time gift, or it could be as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year. And we just, again, encourage you to be part of the Truth Team. If you can do so, we would greatly appreciate it. All of it available at the website, pointofview.net. We come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about what is available on Dr. Paul Barreca's website, how to use these books effectively, and if nothing else, to begin to understand how to use this curriculum in a way that I think would be helpful to the people that you are ministering to. So all of it available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Paul Barreca as we talk about his 2 books on Follow the Master right after these important messages.
Can you name the longest-running talk show in television history? Can you? It was Larry King Live, which ran for 25 years. That's a good run made possible by millions of dollars in advertising money. But did you know that this year, Point of View celebrates 45 years on the air? 45 years made possible by people like you. No program lasts that long without making a difference, and we realize the many stories we know are just the proverbial tip of the iceberg of what God has done and is doing through your giving. You make every bit of that possible. Stop what you're doing for a couple of minutes, make the call, or click on in and be the one listener out of 800 who invests in changing lives. Join the team. Do it monthly. Not investing takes no effort. Be exceptional. Be the one. Call 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Be the one.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation in studio today with Dr. Paul Barreca. Follow the Master, a discipleship course for growing Christians, and also Follow the Master, how Jesus made disciples. Let's, for just a minute before we get back into the content, just talk about these, because I know that we have, Paul, listeners. Some are pastors, some are Sunday school teachers, some are small group leaders. There may be even some seminary students listening, and they go, okay, tell me a little bit more about this, because what you have are, in this particular book, 34 different lessons. You also have scripture cards, scripture memory cards in the back. You have a way in which people can fill in the blanks. So this is made so that whether you are going through it individually as a growing Christian, or whether you're leading a group of young Christians who you've led to the Lord, or whether you're teaching this in a small group or a Bible fellowship, you've pretty much provided everything that an individual needs if they want to teach this.
It's really based on something we started at our church as a curriculum for our members to be able to use, and we're so thankful to be able to share it with Point of View listeners today. This really never had in mind of a book for really everyone. It was just an internal curriculum. We printed the first lessons on our copier machine, and we're giving them out. But Kirby, we began to see that as missionaries would come to church and visit, or as some of our members left and went to other places around the country, they might have moved to some other state, they said, hey, can we have a copy of that? And soon we found this is being used all over the place. Our friends in the Philippines, some missionaries with Word of Life, are using this as a curriculum, and I believe they have several hundred churches in the Philippines that they've trained in how to use this Bible study curriculum. So it's doctrinally based. It really covers the doctrines that you would study at Bible college in maybe a one-year Bible school.
Right.
But on a very simple level, so that in about a year's time, meeting once a week, you and a friend, or even just you by yourself, or really the primary goal is a small group, because when you think about Jesus and his disciples, that was really a small group, wasn't it?
Sure.
And so if you have a small group Bible study and you want to really just establish some foundations in the faith and the doctrines of the Christian faith, this would be a tool that might be very helpful to you. That's the Follow the Master Discipleship Course. The second book is Follow the Master, How Jesus Made Disciples. And that's really the philosophy, or a study of how did Jesus do this? Is it something more than, do the Gospels give us something more than just events in the life of Jesus? Is he really laying out for us the plan for making disciples? So, Kirby, one thing I like to think about is you think about Jesus and giving the Great Commission. There's Jesus, and after the resurrection, the angel told the disciples to go into Galilee and that Jesus would meet them there. Well, Galilee was a really special place. That was the place where all the miracles took place. Jesus was from Nazareth, not far from there. Cana, where the first miracle took place, was not far from the Sea of Galilee. So of all of the places that Jesus could have given the Great Commission, he gave it to them in Galilee. And I'm thinking as Jesus is by the seashore, just kind of picture the mountains in the background, and maybe as Jesus is talking and says, go into all the world, maybe Peter's thinking about that first time that Jesus said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. Or maybe Andrew's thinking about the great storm that was on the seaward. And all of these thoughts are recurring. So the Great Commission is given in the context of that relationship that Jesus had with the 12. By looking at that relationship and the way that Jesus discipled his 12, we can really gain some principles for our lives and the way that we make disciples today.
Well, and again, he tells them later in Acts to go out into Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. And the first few chapters are what happens in Jerusalem. The next set of chapters are what happens in Judea and Samaria. And then the final chapters in the book of Acts are what happens in the uttermost parts of the world. So you have such perfect patterns, not only in the Gospels, but in the book of Acts. I know you've taught through that recently, just to, again, help people with discipleship. But if people say, okay, I would like to get some of these books, maybe I'll get one and I'll decide if I want it, or maybe I want to get a lot of books, and then maybe I say, maybe I would like to talk to you. Is there a way that they can communicate with you, maybe have you come in and do a kickoff, or maybe if they find themselves saying, okay, I don't know what chapter 32 is all about. Can you explain that? Is there a way that people can communicate with you?
Sure. For listeners, a point of view, we would be very happy to do that. Probably the best way is through our ministry website, and that is very simple. 6 letters, FIM.org.
Yes.
That's for Fellowship International Mission. And you'll find links to the books, both books, on FIM's webpage, FIM.org. Of course, they're here at Point of View as well, pointofview.net. I have another website that really contains some sermons.
Sermons, yes. I knew you had those.
If there's maybe a pastor and say, well, I mean, this guy's kind of interesting and maybe I'd like to watch a sermon, well, they can go to followthemaster.org.
Right.
The books are available there as well. Of course, they're on Amazon and whatever type of book service you like to use. Most likely you'll find them there as well. But probably the best way for communicating is www.fim.org.
And we have that link there as well. And as people are watching this on YouTube, we have your picture and that link and also some of the other links as well. Well, let's, if we can, for just a minute, get back into Follow the Master, a discipleship course for growing Christians. And I've got Bob Smith with me. He just became a Christian the other day, and he's wanting to know, how do I begin to develop the Christian life? And, of course, we tell them, well, first of all, I want you to read God's Word. I want you to read the Bible, and I want you to start praying. But if you were to actually give somebody an advice on how they would begin to disciple a new believer, what would you say?
Well, Bob, first of all, it'd be great to find a good church. That's vitally important. And then I'd say, Bob, you want to continue to listen to pointofview.net. Listen to the Point of View programs because you're going to hear a lot of good things. But, Bob, there's some resources that might be helpful for you, and it may be connecting with a discipleship course or a small group, and that's really what this material is for. You know, it's the interaction of our lives together that really helps us to something more than just coming to church. In fact, most of our churches over the years have developed things like Sunday school classes, and sometimes those programs get institutionalized. We just do them, we show up, and we kind of do it out of habit, and we've lost the real reason why they existed. I think it's a really wonderful thing. A lot of churches are going back to small group ministries, and small groups are a great way to learn some of the resources, some of the lessons of discipleship, because it is life on life.
You know, one of the things that I think somebody's going to think when they get this book is, why 34 chapters? And that's something that I appreciate you doing, because you have whole chapters on the obvious about prayer and witnessing and who Jesus is and who the Holy Spirit is. But you take in, as we just mentioned, things like the sanctity of life, sex and marriage, spiritual gifts, the whole issue of judgments. You know, we did a program the other day. We had a guest in studio, and I know that he needs to read that chapter because he said on air something, and I don't always correct people's theological errors on the air, but it just illustrates again that we get sort of a development of our Christian life in a haphazard way. You would not go to a business and have them say, well, just hang around the business and you'll sort of figure it out. They probably have a very organized curriculum to make sure that you understand all the different aspects of your job. And yet, sadly, there are individuals I know that would benefit by reading some of these chapters because somehow in the process of becoming mature Christians, there's been some real gaps. It's almost looked like Swiss cheese, and that's one of the reasons why you have 34 chapters.
That's right. You talk often, Kirby, about our post-truth culture.
Yes.
And, you know, we live in a society where if you look at most of the Bible study curriculums or videos and teaching videos that are out there, they all kind of help us in maybe connecting and feeling better about ourselves or about our faith. They're all very practical oriented. The idea of doctrine's kind of fallen out of favor, but really, doctrine establishes us in the truth.
Right.
Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And we need to have the truth in addition to the experiences of the Christian life, things of prayer requests and answers to prayer and fellowship. Those are all wonderful things. But there also needs to be a foundation of the truth. And so in the curriculum, we try to help new believers or perhaps believers who have not really been established in the truth. I found as a pastor, a lot of folks coming to our church that might have been Christians for many, many years, but they really didn't understand even the most basic doctrines of the Christian faith. And I try to put something together that would be helpful to them and to our congregation.
Again, that's why I think this book is so unique. Not to say that there aren't other good discipleship books, and you mentioned some of my friends over the years that have written books on discipleship and individuals that have been on this program. But again, let me just commend to you the two books, Follow the Master, A Discipleship Course for Growing Christians. When we come back, I want to talk about the newest book, Follow the Master, How Jesus Made Disciples. Maybe we can talk about how is it the disciples became so passionate about discipleship, and how did that look like, and what was it like to actually be a disciple of Jesus, to later then, of course, carry the gospel into Asia Minor and what it was like to actually follow Paul and those kinds of things. So we'll get into that a little bit more detail, but if you find yourself saying, these are interesting books, I'd like to know a little bit more, or I'd like to at least see a little bit more about those books, we have the links to the website. Again, you can go to Fellowship International Mission and find out more about that great ministry, but also find out about these books. So it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Dr. Paul Barreca in with us for just a few more minutes. We'll talk about how Jesus made disciples. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. America is known for its commitment to religious liberty. People have always fled foreign lands persecuting their faith for a safe place to exercise their religion. That's part of the story of our founding. For the most part, the majority religion practiced here has been Christianity. According to a recent poll by the Public Religion Research Institute, that may be changing. The survey, conducted in all 50 states with more than 101,000 Americans, is called America's Changing Religious Identity. The big takeaway is that the religious landscape is changing in this country, especially in the under 30 crowd. There are Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist populations that are on the rise, while the Christian community, both Catholic and Protestant, appear to be shifting downward. It's an interesting study and worth our attention. It reminds us that the promise of the First Amendment is a promise that Americans would be free to exercise their religion, not the religion of the state. It also reminds us that religious liberty is a promise for all religions in this country. I think that promise is a good thing. It allows for a robust debate, the opportunity to debate finer theological points, and to settle our disagreements over eternal matters peacefully and respectfully. The bottom line is this: America's religious landscape may change, but our commitment to religious liberty cannot. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes in studio with me today, Dr. Paul Barreca. We've been talking about Follow the Master books, a discipleship course for growing Christians, and then let's talk about this one, how Jesus made disciples. I think it's a good question. You know, we use Jesus as the example, and we see how they were passionate witnesses for Jesus Christ. Can you, after your study and writing a doctoral dissertation on it, give us a little bit of a sense about how Jesus was able to motivate them to be such dynamic disciples in the first century?
You know, as we think about the 12, there's really nothing about them that marks them as significant. We often talk about their common nature. They were fishermen. There was a tax collector. They weren't the trained. They weren't the educated. Jesus took the ordinary people of life, just like most of us today, and through his life and through the Spirit's ministry in their lives, they became dynamic witnesses, all of them trusting the Lord and following the Lord and even giving their lives for the Lord. But, you know, as you think about the disciples, there's a real growth process that takes place with them as well. When we think about the call of disciples, I think we automatically think of the Sea of Galilee and Jesus saying, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." Most of us probably don't realize that's the second call of the disciples. And it really takes place about a year and a half into the ministry of Jesus. The first was after the baptism at the Jordan with John, where John's disciples, Peter and Andrew and Nathan, are following John and listening to John the Baptist. And then John points them to Jesus and they begin following Jesus. But they only do so part-time. It isn't until the Sea of Galilee, about a year and a half later, that they begin following Jesus full-time. And so as we think about discipleship and we think about helping people grow, it's really a long process. And it's a process that involves just living life together and doing more than just teaching lessons. I think maybe in the church today we've got a little too much emphasis on that idea of, well, I just need to teach a good lesson and then everybody will get it. That's not how most of us learn. Most of us, it's got to be really integrated more into the fabric of our lives.
I would think so. Now, you've actually dug into this, so could you help us maybe understand how you kind of discovered how Jesus did this discipleship process? Because it's one thing to read a lot of books, but I know you were digging into the scriptures as well to see if there's some other things that maybe you would pick up that other people had missed.
Well, a couple of things. The first is I looked at the chronology of the life of Jesus. And there's some great tools, and that's a very important study. A lot of your listeners may have used a chronological study of the Bible. My wife, Kim, turned me on to this a number of years ago. She found a Bible that was arranged chronologically where you read through the Bible in 1 year. Mm-hmm. And she loved that and was gaining all kinds of insights. That's a really great study, a really great way to do that. And so I took a Harmony of the Gospels, a common one by A.T. Robertson out 100 or so years ago, and looked at the life of Jesus and the things he did with his disciples. And I began to see that there's some real repeatable patterns in the life of Christ. Like, for example, Jesus, his emphasis on relationships and just living life together with his disciples. The fact that he started slowly and taught lessons that progress. In other words, one truth built upon the foundation of another truth upon another truth. There were times that Jesus said to them, "I have more to teach you, but I can't yet. You're not ready to hear it." Mm-hmm. And sometimes we get a new believer and we just want to dump everything right on them. And we forget that there has to be some time to develop those truths. So I looked at the life of Christ chronologically and began to develop a really philosophy of discipleship based on the things that Jesus did. And then, interestingly enough, when you go to the early church in the book of Acts, when you go to the ministry of the Apostle Paul, you begin to see that they really were repeating the very things that Jesus did. They were building truth upon truth. They were building relationships. The church was living in community together. Paul was doing the very things that Jesus did with his disciples. He had some who followed him, like Timothy and Tychicus and Epaphras and others, and he would send them on ministry assignments, just like Jesus did with the 12. And so there's really a pattern that we can see not only in the Gospels, but even in the book of Acts and in the epistles about this kind of relationship-centered truth and developing of this Christian life.
Now, part of it is replication, because in 2 Timothy 2:2, you have, of course, Paul writing to Timothy, and he says, again, you take the things that you've heard from me and entrust those to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. It seems to me that one of the good tests of discipleship is whether your disciple can make another disciple. Is that fair?
It sure is. In fact, if you're making disciples that are not able to reproduce, that effort is only going to last one generation.
Right.
And so one of the goals as we think about discipleship and as our listeners are thinking about, well, what can I do and how can I think about discipleship, it's to think about the goal. The goal is to build into the lives of others so that they're spiritually mature, so that they are mature, meaning grounded in their faith. They're not infants, they're mature. Secondly, that they're self-sustaining. They're not dependent on you to learn more about the Bible. They're not dependent on the pastor to teach a sermon. When issues come up in their lives, they have the ability to go to the Word themselves and to find out those answers. So mature, self-sustaining, but the third is just what you mentioned, Kirby, reproducing.
Right.
That they're able to share their faith with someone else and continue this process going. That's the way that the Christian faith continues on. That's what Jesus told us to do.
So whether we're doing it in the church or in missions, I might mention again, being the executive director of the Fellowship of International Mission, this is something that has been the way in which we've done evangelism and mission work for centuries and millennia, right?
It really is. Just teaching one person who can teach others. And Paul talks about that in 2 Timothy chapter 2, the same commit to faithful men who'll be able to teach others also. I call that the 2-2-2 principle, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2.
Yes.
Easy to remember. And as we think about our efforts in making disciples, it's not just getting people to come to church. I mean, all of us are concerned, and we ought to be concerned about our neighbors. We want to be sharing the gospel. And many times we'll do things like invite them to church. That's very good, and we should at least be doing that. But really, we want more than church attenders. And as we think about how is the Christian faith going to progress, how are we going to reach people in other cultures, it's more than just getting them to attend church. It's getting them to be mature, getting them to be self-sustaining, and then reproducing that very same process over and over again until Jesus comes and takes us home. And that's our goal.
Well, again, that 2-2-2 principle is in chapter 34 of the book. And so, again, some great resources. I would be remiss if I were also mention the fact that if somebody was interested in missions, want to know more about that, as the executive director of the Fellowship International Mission, they could contact you there as well, couldn't they?
They certainly can, and we really are able to help folks that have maybe some unique ideas about missions. And we have some young people that are really doing some unique things in missions. And FIM really specializes in helping them to find the way to communicate the gospel in unique and creative ways. We have the experience to be able to help some of those folks get into the area of missions and perhaps think about being either a short-term, a mid-term, or even a full career type of missionary.
So again, Dr. Paul Barreca has been in studio with us. We've talked about his two books, Follow the Master, one on discipleship for growing Christians, the other on how Jesus made disciples. Thank you so very much for being in studio with us today.
It's been a real privilege, Kirby, to talk to you and to talk to your listeners today. And if we can be of any resource to them, we're always happy to do that as well.
We have all the links on our website, pointofview.net. And just before we go, let me first of all tell you that we once again would want to encourage you to join with us for our Truth Team Week that took place last week. We'll still keep that open a little bit longer because some of you would still like to make a pledge. And even though we're going off the air, you can give us a call. 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. As you go to the website, you can find out more about the Follow the Master books, but also click on that button that says Be the One, join the team, and we would greatly appreciate your financial support. A one-time gift or certainly a weekly or monthly gift would be appropriate. We've encouraged many of you to consider maybe joining at the level that would be as simple as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year. And if you can do that, we would greatly appreciate that. And if you appreciate what you've learned about discipleship, go out and practice it as well. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Your chance of winning the lottery is 1 in about 200 million. And for those of us who don't play, it's a lot worse, or should I say a lot better. Anyway, the chance you're a partner with Point of View, for every 800 people who listen, 1 invests so we can be here with you. In this age of fake news, 1 in 800 plays a vital part in Point of View's work, bringing the church and the nation credible and important information, real news, news that makes a difference. Be exceptional today. Join Truth Team 360. Visit pointofview.net/team. Choose your level of support and be confident you've invested wisely. Point of View has a 45-year legacy of changed lives and changed communities. Schools, ministries, defenders of life and liberty. You make that possible. Take a couple of minutes right now and join Truth Team 360. pointofview.net/team, or give by calling 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.